Welcome, everybody. I'm just going to introduce our first speaker, who's very well known to many of us in the ECMO community. Professor Daniel Brodie is an emollient diplomat, a global thought leader, and is probably the world's most fecund and prolific ECMO publisher ever. And he's also professor and director of the adult ECMO program at Columbia University Medical Center in New York. He's going to talk to us about how the media and social media might influence our practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Graham. If I had $1 for every time I've been called an emollient diplomat. Anyway, so this is a little bit of a different topic than we normally tackle, but perhaps in the era of misinformation and disinformation, in an era where, when we stop and think about it, the media landscape has never been more crowded, with more competition for eyes and ears. Perhaps this is a very important topic for us and our patients, because we begin to understand how the information that comes through the media translates to the way that we interact with our patients and their surrogate decision makers, their loved ones. So I think this entire session will be very illuminating, and I hope you'll enjoy it. What we'll start with is the influence of media and social media on our practices. First, disclosures, none particularly relevant to this talk, perhaps my role at ELSO. So the first thing I would ask is, do media portrayals of critical illness in general faithfully reflect reality? And if they don't, could an overly optimistic or pessimistic portrayal of outcomes in the media skew the choices of our patients and their surrogate decision makers? And I'll start with the case of CPR. I think it's a good example, obviously a very common practice within medicine. And let's look at the influence of television. A little bit retro, but we'll start there. And for those of you who know me, you know that this is my favorite paper of all time. This is from the New England Journal in 1994, and it was called Cardiopulmonary Resuscitation on Television. Now, I consider these authors to be among the most brilliant in the history of medicine for having published in the New England Journal by watching TV. What they say in their introduction is that responsible shared decision-making about the potential use of CPR requires patients who are educated about the procedures, risks, and benefits. Makes sense. And they also point out that TV is an important source of information about CPR for patients, and that's just the reality. And so what they did is they watched the episodes of ER, Chicago Hope, and Rescue 911, television shows that were popular at the time, for the 1994 to 1995 viewing season. And they identified all episodes of CPR as if they were real. These were obviously fictional, but they identified them as if they were real. And they looked at the, at the cause of cardiac arrest, the patient demographics, and the underlying illnesses and outcomes. And you can see here that this is perhaps a little atypical for the kinds of patients that we might see in our ICUs on a regular basis. These are the causes: near drowning, motor vehicle accident, gunshot wound, stab wound, other trauma. Oh, and then we get to arrhythmia, cardiac arrest. But of course, lightning strike, eclampsia, this is a little bit atypical. When we look at who the population was, if you look at middle-aged and older adults, that was only 35% of the entire cohort. That probably doesn't ring true for most of us who are in the ICU. And then when you look at survival, does this sound right? 77%? Oh, obviously, your ICUs are similar to ours. So 60 incidents were recorded of CPR across 97 episodes on these television shows, mostly trauma, because that's sexier. 28% were primary cardiac. That's obviously less than we normally see. Fully two-thirds in children and young adults. Again, more dramatic for television, but not necessarily reflective of what we see in an ICU, and 77% post-arrest survival. So when all of that is said and done, to our patients, this is CPR, right? Can the IT person cue the Baywatch music? No. And the question then is, does it matter, right? Does it actually impact what goes on with our patients? And so this is an earlier paper from the New England Journal, actually from 1994. This is a more serious paper in the traditional sense. It's the influence of the probability of survival of patients according to preferences for cardiopulmonary resuscitation. And so they did interviews with 287 patients who were at least 60 years old. The mean age was 77. And they were asked about CPR during an acute illness. Would you want it? And 41% of them said, yeah, sure, I'll take it. I'll sign up for CPR. But that was before they learned the probability of prognosis. And once they were told that the likelihood of survival if they did have a cardiac arrest was 10 to 17%, half of them said, no, thank you. And it went down to 22%. So informing the patients of prognosis greatly impacted the way that they made their choices. And this is what shared decision-making is all about. If they were then told of a chronic illness with a life expectancy of less than a year, only 11% opted for CPR. When they were then told further that the likelihood of survival after an arrest in that context was 0 to 5%, once again, only half of them, 5%, opted to choose CPR. So what we know matters. And there's a disconnect. And that disconnect is between what families, patients, and their loved ones believe to be true and what we know to be true. And so just as with TV, what's on the internet may get to them before we can and begin to form their opinions. So shared decision-making becomes difficult when we have two realities. And I think we can all relate to that these days, at least in the United States, perhaps a few other countries. It is very important to be speaking the same language and have the same truths. But do families actually search the internet for medical information? Of course. And so this is a paper from Intensive Care Medicine looking at families in Europe, where 6 out of 10 Europeans were searching the internet for information, but only a third of them were talking to their intensivists about it. So in the end, families search the internet. We may not know what they're seeing, and what they see may be overly optimistic or overly pessimistic, and it may not reflect reality. So decision-making about an intervention or prognostication itself may be predicated on false assumptions of the likelihood of success or failure. So families may want interventions, like ECMO, even when we think they're ill-advised, and that becomes a problem. So internet searches may be driven by all sorts of intentions. This is just an example. A guy named John Ayers does a lot of these papers just looking at search volume. And you can see this is hydroxychloroquine at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, and when Elon Musk decides that it's a great idea, yet another great idea that he has, that all of a sudden there's more searches. And of course, as soon as Donald Trump got into the act, the number of searches dramatically increased. This is the information that people are seeing. So this may lead to erroneous conclusions depending on what information is available. And so now, how do we begin to take that context and apply it to ECMO? So what do patients and surrogates know about ECMO from the media, and is it realistic? We know that ECMO improves outcomes in selected, or some would say highly selected patients, but ECMO is also associated with major complications, consumes considerable resources. That's what we all know. So extremely ill patients can still survive with ECMO, and those kinds of cases may get the most attention of all, but they may not be reflective of all of the cases that we see. Shannon Fernando is a colleague now in Toronto. He was in Ottawa at the time. He and Rebecca Matthew really helped with devising this particular search strategy so that we could begin to do, not with fictional cases, but with real cases that can be found on the internet, just as they did in 1996. And so we did a systematic search of English language news articles related to ECMO. This is in JAMA Internal Medicine. It was Google News and Bloomberg from 1960, so we started all the way back at near the dawn of ECMO, going through April 30th, 2020. I don't have to remind you what was happening at the time. What we included were either written or video documentation, nonfiction, anything published by any third party, but we excluded private websites, those things that were only on social networking sites, and things that were already peer-reviewed journal articles. We wanted to get at what was out there that was not peer-reviewed. We extracted patient data and outcomes using a standardized data collection form. For patients who were in hospital at the time of reporting, we searched for evidence of survival and mortality in later reports, which you can come up with more than you think. And we looked at the neonatal population, pediatric and adult, separately. So all told, there were 12,000 news reports, 600 unique reports from 31 countries. Then there's some additional material that we didn't publish in that article. This is Google search trends from 2004 through 2020. There weren't many trends back in 1960. And this compared we compared the publication trends and we compared it with ELSO data. So you can see the black line. It's from the ELSO registry. This is the increase in cases over time that we've seen in the ELSO registry. And you can see it tracking more or less with both media cases in red and with the Google search popularity in blue. This is similar across the different countries where we found all of these trends. And you can see here there's what I call the COVID bump. This was the end of the period that we looked at. And you can see a huge increase in searches related to ECMO because of COVID. And then there are these other blips at different times. One particularly large one is due to a very famous case in India, and that really lit up the internet with searches for ECMO at that time. So here's the data as we extracted it, and you can see that we had 605, 401 of them were adult, 140 pediatric, and the neonatal were 64, so a little bit adult predominant. The mean age was almost 30. And you can see most of the cases, about 3/4, were from the most recent era, 2016 to 2020. 2/3 of cases were in North America, and about half were respiratory failure and half cardiac failure. When you look at mortality, you now see this is mortality at the time of publication of the article without follow-up. You see that the mortality was 7.8%. These are very good centers. And you can see that 18% of patients were still in hospital at the time of publication. And I think even more striking than the mortality statistic is how many patients were functionally well at the time of discharge. And the answer in these articles is 88%. So 88% had no or minimal functional disability at the time of discharge. You can also see that there was a smattering of heart and lung transplant thrown in. So overly optimistic portrayals of ECMO, particularly on the internet, and I would say that that mortality rate and that rate of survival with being intact is overly optimistic. And it is definitely occurring on the internet. Here's an earlier paper by the Taiwanese group looking at 4 major newspapers in Taiwan. This is 2006 to 2010, so newspapers were then a bigger source of information. They also did an internet search in 2011 looking at appearances of ECMO, and they just compared the survival rates. So ELSO survival rate overall at that time, 47%. In the newspapers, survival was much higher at 61%, and on the internet, 84%. So it just gives you a sense of the skew that we're seeing when we look at the media. But ECMO is not the only way to look at this. We're very interested in this concept in general. So what about ARDS? What about PE as other examples? So looking at the case of ARDS, Shannon went back to work, and we used the same methodology, looking at 1960 through 2020, this time through November. We found 69,000 news stories, 1,200 full-text articles, 222 unique stories from 25 countries. And here you can see similar data. This was male predominant, a little bit more than half. The mean age was 38. Again, 75% of cases were more recent. And in the United States, that accounted for about half of the cases. And then if you look at the causes of ARDS, bacterial and viral pneumonia between them were 53%. So summarizing that, with a mean age of 38, 56% men, 75% published after 2016, and more than half from the US, we found 54% were pulmonary infections, with only 11% being COVID even at that time. And here you can see deaths at the time of publication. This is for ARDS, 60%. So that's a relatively high mortality. And again, no disability or full function in 84% of these cases that were reported in the media. So there's clearly a substantial publication bias, right? So online media related to ARDS, you have the connection between ARDS and COVID-19 was clearly underrepresented relative to everything else that was going on at the time. Mortality was higher than we would expect at 60% for all comers with ARDS, so reflecting a particular subset of ARDS patients. And again, with ECMO, it was particularly optimistic. Here, it's more pessimistic. But then there's a disconnect with that as well, because 84% of these patients had no disability, and that's just not what we see with patients with ARDS. So Moving on to the last example is pulmonary embolism. Again, same methodology, this time from 1990 to 2020. 38,000 stories, 576 unique stories from 39 countries. And here you see a bit of a female predominance, the age of 40. A little bit farther back in terms of the data, so about 85% of the data from 2011 on. And the mortality at the time of publication, 55%. And again, they tend to report on patients who have good functional outcomes, so about 87%. So here in the case of PE, the media reported, compared with scientific literature, were younger patients. Interestingly, there were rarer causes of PE. So the top 5 causes of actual causes of PE represented fewer than 15% of the cases that were reported. They reported high rates of physician misdiagnosis, and nearly all cases required admission to the hospital. So this is, again, it's a skew, but it's a skew for reasons. I'm not implying that all of this is intentionally done to manipulate us. It's just that they're pulling individual cases out of a sea of what we often experience. So when we think about it, and I think this is the framing for the rest of the session, media reports have selection bias. There's selection bias, right? They are choosing the cases that, for different reasons, are more spectacular, are more interesting, and frankly are going to sell newspapers. But what is the impact of media bias? Well, here are the important points that I would try to bring home. One, it distorts the expectations of outcomes. It complicates shared decision-making because we have 2 different realities about what the outcomes potentially are, and outcomes affect decision-making. And it impacts requests for treatment. And importantly, particularly in the era of COVID-19, it influences participation in clinical trials. If you're not dealing with the right information, you may not feel comfortable participating. So the issue is, I think, of particularly grave importance during the pandemic, which sort of looks like it's over, but we know it's not entirely over. Let's hope it's over. But it is particularly important now because we need to be speaking the same language. So what can we do? I don't think this is an indictment of the media at all. I think it's on us as healthcare professionals and as organizations to engage with the media, to educate the media, and in a conscious effort to fill the messaging void with voices that actually are knowledgeable about what's going on throughout medicine. But I would end by saying that the problem may be much bigger than we actually realize. So this is a problem that I think we're going to have to confront over the coming years and decades. But I do think, and I think one of the strengths of this session is that it must be a partnership with people in media and finding the right voices and having those voices amplify what we think are the important messages for our patients and their loved ones. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan, for that really fascinating talk, and I think that's a great way to frame the remainder of this discussion. We are very fortunate today to have our next two speakers, Graham McLaren from Singapore, our soon-to-be ELSO president, and Gideon Gill. We're very fortunate to have the former science editor from the Boston Globe, involved in 3 Pulitzer Prizes, and currently one of the managing directors of Stat Media, which Gideon can frame for us all. He is a very reputable and wonderful journalist, and we're very lucky to have him with Graham conducting an interview of the typical interviewer. So, Gideon, Graham.
Thanks very much, Cara. Gideon, welcome. It can't be a kind of normal part of your day to talk to 1,200 ECMO experts. So welcome.
Thank you. I feel a bit, after Dan's talk, a little bit like I've been set up. But,
that's right. Well, maybe I would like to take that last point that Dan made about there's so much out there, and I think within the confines of professional journalists who value their own reputation, in order to survive, a lot of them or all of them have to be behind a paywall. So how do you as a journalist hold yourself to the highest standards, but also disseminate the most accurate information to the widest possible population?
Sure. Thanks. It is a pleasure to be here. If I can just say before I answer that, just to tell you that Stat News is based here in Boston. It's an online, for those who don't know us, we started 7 years ago. We're an online site. We're affiliated with the Boston Globe, but separate, and we focus on covering health and medicine and life sciences, mainly in the US, but we're actually expanding into Europe, so look for that. And we were actually the first US-based news organization in the first week of January that began publishing on COVID. The rest of the media was distracted by an impeachment trial and Kobe Bryant's death and things like that. So, but in answer to your question, we do have a paywall. You know, a lot of news organizations found that they could no longer make money from being sustained by advertising, which was the predominant model for decades. That, you know, Google, Facebook, other social media, like swallowed up most of the advertising dollars online. And so the model that's proven successful from a financial standpoint is to sign up subscribers and get people to subscribe. But you raise a very good point that then creates a barrier to the widespread of information. And so what we and many news organizations, reputable news organizations did at the start of the pandemic is we put all the content about COVID outside of our paywalls. And so in fact, our readership in 2019, our average monthly readership was 1.5 million, and in March of 2020, we had 23 million unique readers, just to give you a sense of how that reach blew up because of that.
Okay. I mean, that's a similar model to what a lot of the medical journals did.
Yeah.
Again, most of the reputable ones have a paywall, but they made all the information on COVID free in the public interest.
Yeah.
So I guess there are parallels there. Maybe we can just, hopefully we're coming off the back of the pandemic now. Looking backwards, what are the key lessons for professional journalists about how information was delivered to the public and how accurate, responsible, reliable information was delivered to the public? Do you think that the media got it right? Or how would they do better next time?
Well, let me answer it in a couple of ways. One is, I think the media is a broad phrase. So I think news organizations like Stat, like the New York Times, like the Wall Street Journal, really worked hard to get it right in an environment where there was, at first, very little information, and even the medical community, the public health community wasn't getting it right because we just didn't know. And that is it's extraordinarily tricky environment to be working in. In addition, we had no access to hospitals. Families couldn't get in hospitals. Media couldn't get in hospitals. So we were very dependent on folks like you to tell us what was going on inside hospitals. And there was, the normal way of information flow that happens where papers get published in journals, and the media, typically a lot of the medical information flows where we get embargoed journal articles a week or so before the article comes out. We contact people, we call you, Graham, and other folks and get comments on the studies, and then we publish articles about it. Well, that all went out the window. And now you had a lot of information being published on preprint servers. Like very quickly, non-peer-reviewed work was going up. And our policy on looking at articles in preprint servers is to similarly try to vet them, to call the experts that we know and say, can you look at this and tell us what you make of this? Well, the thing is that we weren't the only ones looking at preprint servers. Preprint servers are public, and the public very quickly found them. And so when you saw reports like, hydroxychloroquine when that started getting out, it was on the internet. It was on social media, and people who didn't really know, social media. Anybody, the old thing about on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. The photo of the dog, and similarly on social media, nobody knows if you're an expert. You can just proclaim yourself to be an expert, and so the information that we were studiously trying to get right very often was overtaken by what was on social media.
Yeah, no, I mean, we have total sympathy with you, because trying to sort out the amount of chaotic messaging within the medical community about what worked and what didn't, and what was just a good theory versus practical reality was very, very difficult for all of us. And the other problem, of course, was if you conduct a study, it takes several months to collate the data, to analyze it, to publish it, and by that time it may not be relevant. And whilst the world is kind of collapsing under the weight of a pandemic, it's a very difficult situation to be in. One thing that we all noticed, I think, was that in the past, people would not dare venture an opinion on something outside of their own realm of expertise. But over the last 2 years, and I'm sure in America, but certainly elsewhere in the world, everybody became an expert in infectious diseases, in public health. Everybody had an opinion about everything related to COVID, what the government should be doing or shouldn't be doing, etc. Do you think there was too much information given to the public? Was it too technical?
So I think that in a sense, we had no choice, because for one, the information, as I said, was already getting out there, like through social media. So the editors like me are looking at social media feeds and seeing all of this misinformation that's circulating. And so, for example, with hydroxychloroquine, ordinarily, if this wasn't a pandemic and there were some people just putting this kind of misinformation out, it would have been ignored. But in the absence of any real, anything, the public is hungry for certainty, and science is full of uncertainty. And particularly in the start of a pandemic, we had no answers. And so anybody who was posting and saying, here's the answer, that got widely grabbed onto. I mean, it's people were looking for hopeful messages. And so we felt that, we had to try to stem that by writing in great detail about the lack of rigor of these early studies on hydroxychloroquine, that these weren't randomized trials, that they were, it turned out much of it was fraudulent. And we were doing our best to try to counter that misinformation. Unfortunately, in a very politicized environment, that also became, I think we had limited success, because, the audiences, we tried, we reached 23 million people, but not everybody, the people who read the organs that they want to read, the news organizations they want to read. And so it's frustrating, because you can't always, we're constantly falling behind with trying to counter misinformation.
Yeah. And as far as ECMO is concerned, ECMO, at least, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the States, it's not the lingua franca of people walking around the street. It's a low volume, high risk activity. It has substantial mortality associated with its use, largely because of the diseases that it's used to try and save lives with. How do you, as a journalist, try and capture the essence of ECMO when you're explaining it to a lay audience without kind of dumbing it down, or, as Dan highlighted, creating unreasonable expectation?
Yeah, I mean, I think Dan made an excellent point in his presentation that, when you think about what is news, like when news organizations, when you talk about what is news, what gets people to pick up the newspaper or click on a link, and it's something that's new or actually out of the ordinary. And so it's why the cases that get written about you know, you said the PE cases that get written about were all really highly unusual. And, you know, it's because, well, if you were just going to write about the 90% of the case, that wouldn't be new. So, and I think, you know, it's this whole ecosystem, because the hospital PR people know what will appeal to journalists, so they pitch those cases. They don't tell us about the other 90%, and so we tend to then bore in on the things that are unusual. But with ECMO, I think I actually think there was a very good dialogue that took place between this community and journalists, because there were a number of really informative articles. We wrote some of them, the Wall Street Journal did, other news organizations, about, and it was made possible because people in your community let us in on it. And so there was a weekly, many of you may have been part of this a Friday Zoom forum that started very early in the pandemic, that brought in people from the ECMO world around starting in places like China and Italy, where they were getting hit early, to inform physicians here in the US and elsewhere in the world. And they actually invited one of a writer named Ron Winslow, who wrote a piece for us about the learning that was taking place, and how from individual cases, data was being shared among this community, and how everyone learned about which case, at first it looked very dismal with ECMO, and then you slowly figured out which patients would benefit the most, and how to control clotting risks. And I think we took the time to spend, Ron spent months sitting in on these sessions to produce a really careful story. And I think there were other journalists that did the same, to try to really inform the public on what ECMO was. We did a graphic that showed how it worked, so I think I think there are journalists that did a very good job with explaining it.
So the flip side of that is that a lot of us in the ECMO community suddenly found ourselves in the glare of the media spotlight, and usually on a local scale, but perhaps some on a national scale, and this was something that we weren't accustomed to it. For example, the first time I was ever approached by the media to comment on ECMO in a local context in the Far East, I'm sitting in my study looking scruffy on a Zoom call, and all of a sudden I have a team of professional journalists with professional hairstylists, makeup artists, sound guys, the whole thing, and I just froze like a deer in the headlights and said, what am I doing? And it's very intimidating as a doctor who's not accustomed to this, to suddenly find yourself in a media spotlight. From your point of view, what do you look for in your interlocutor? Are there things that annoy you? Are there things that you say, yes, this is the kind of guy I'd like to interview? Can you give us some pro tips? Sure.
I think the important thing is to be yourself. Readers and, as a journalist, I get frustrated when somebody's comes in and you can tell they've been coached by the media trainers, and they're uncomfortable, and just giving scripted answers. So look, be yourself. If there's things that you can't address, say, look, I wish I could talk about that, it's confidential, or it's really outside my area of expertise. Whatever you do, don't guess. You don't want to get something wrong. I think you should ask, if somebody contacts you and says, I'd like to interview you, ask them what do you want to talk about? And so for one, you can say, that's really not my area of expertise. You should talk to my colleague, or most journalists won't tell you the specific questions they're going to ask, but they'll give you the general idea of the topic they want to talk about. And then you want to like just be natural,
Okay.
and that's the best advice I give. And also the other important thing is if the journalist doesn't ask you important questions, then you should volunteer the information if they're like getting it completely wrong, if they're missing the context, if they seem to think that 90% of patients, that go on ECMO survive, then you should correct
Call them out.
Yeah.
Okay. My last question is really about the ethics of ECMO. So I've been in a position where I had to provide ECMO for somebody with vaccine-induced myocarditis. And, from my point of view, that's straightforward. There's a clear indication for ECMO. The cause is kind of irrelevant. Put them on ECMO and do your best. But as a journalist, if you got hold of this story, you have to decide, this is potentially newsworthy, or if I go around reporting this, am I promoting the narrative of anti-vaxxers? I'm actually doing harm to the general public by flagging this kind of case. What's your approach to that?
Yeah, so the whole myocarditis and some of the other risks with the vaccines are rare, and it's important. I think we have to write about it. If there's something where there's just there's a distinction between somebody sends me an email and says, my uncle had this rare, died after getting a vaccine. Well, we're not going to write that story without, we have to verify it. We have to do reporting. And people die all the time after getting vaccines. It has nothing to do with the vaccine. So that's not going to be newsworthy. But if there are a whole series of, as there were, that, it has been documented that myocarditis is a small risk, particularly for young men after certain of the vaccines. That's something we ethically are obligated to report, but we have to put in the context of the kind of context I just explained, and that the risks of COVID itself are much greater.
Yeah. So you would report it, but you would try and do it in a balanced way with the facts.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Gideon, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Pleasure talking to you, and pleasure. And I just wanted to thank everyone, this whole community. I just want to say, all of you were really helpful to the public and the media. All the work you did, it was amazing, and we're all very thankful for everything you've done and continue to do.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful discussion, and I think we'll have some time for panel discussion at the conclusion. But without further ado, let me introduce our next speaker, our very esteemed ELSO CEO, Christine Stead, who will discuss ELSO's role in these last few years and where we're going next.
Thank you, Kara, for the introduction. It's so nice to see you all in person and not on Zoom. And I know we've all said that 1,000 times, but I can't tell you how much different it is to be here in person. So welcome. As we get started, I did want to acknowledge a couple of our leaders at ELSO who've worked tirelessly, well, all the time, but especially during the pandemic. And let me just get started with that. In addition, thanking our sponsors. We have Getinge as our platinum sponsor, Medtronic and Abbott as our gold sponsors, and a plethora of amazing sponsors that make this kind of a meeting possible. So thank you to them for letting us gather again in person. This is our board, Matt Payton. You've seen him. Welcome everybody here at our opening plenary. Marco Gino, Dan Brody, and Graham McLaren. We're just both up on stage. Dan is our president-elect. Graham will be our president starting in January. We also have Peter Alexander, who gave remarks in the opening plenary as well. Thomas Mueller will join us soon from Germany. Jay Shyland is here, and of course our founder and board member emeritus, Dr. Bartlett. In addition, we are happy to have John Fraser here from Australia. He does not technically win the award, so don't tell him of traveling the farthest. I know he wants that award, but Melbourne, Australia technically is the farthest away, so Brisbane is close. Nick Barrett, thank you so much. He is our chair of Euro-ELSO, and he's here. And of course, Renee Gomez from Latin America. Poonam Malhotra was not able to be with us today, but we know she's here with us in spirit. Just copying some of the remarks that were shared a little earlier, ELSO, of course, worked a lot with the media during the pandemic, and I wanted to highlight a few of the journalists that we worked with really closely that modeled that, what Gideon was just describing as a professional approach and dedicated. And several of these stories actually took months, although the first one I'll highlight took just 1 month. And that was a financial market reporter from Tokyo, Japan, who called us in March of 2020 to ask about ECMO and what is this. And so we had just recently put together the ELSO COVID-19 dashboard, which was something we asked all of you to do, completely change how you enter data. Instead of waiting until the very end, enter your cases as they come up. And with that information, along with what she had was an online webinar coming out of Japan that documented 18 of 32 successful decannulations in Japan. If you recall, at the time, we had the Diamond Princess waiting in the bay in Japan and what to do with them should they receive ECMO or not. And due to her work, she interviewed Dr. Bartlett. She created a really wonderful graphic that made it a little easier to understand what ECMO was. So it's a good example of doing that kind of work well that Suryatapa Bhattacharya from Tokyo did. Next, we worked with Tom Kerwin, who had an interesting approach with his story. He is an LA Times reporter out in LA, and he released 3 stories on the same day. So this is all done on March, the same date here, March 12th, 2021, but based on months of work. And one of the articles he had was the history of ECMO. And there again, Dr. Bartlett provided, I think you provided some of the photos here for Tom to work with, but this was one of the 3 stories he released on the same day. Another was following a patient and her story, including several of the images from when she was first getting sick to her care in the hospital and the team that was involved. And then last but not least, a beautiful story of Bianca Lopez's reunion with her team at UCLA. It was a well-done 3-part series that helped inform the community about what this was. At the time that the story was released, the LA area was going through a really big surge and actually were rationing oxygen at hospitals. So it's the kind of partnership that was important for our community to hear and see. Yes, it's a success story, but the way she highlighted the work of the team was really to be commended. Next, we worked with Sherry Fink from the New York Times over, I want to say, 4 months, where Sherry called us at ELSO and asked a little bit about how this works. She's a physician by training, so she knows a little bit about medicine in general, but she did her work, and the way she told this story, I thought was very well done. She followed several different patients, but one, of course, was a physician himself, David Gutierrez, who you see here on ECMO, and this is her front page, or first image in the story, which is about how rationing ECMO was something we were all thinking about at the time. Next, she was sharing some of the stories of our ECMO teams, and here's a lovely moment that she captured of someone really celebrating a milestone of a patient doing just a little bit better in an ICU. And last but not least, of course, Dr. Gutierrez at home with his family recovering from ECMO. More recently, this is just this year, in March, there was coverage of a study that was a single center approach, but a good one, that was led by the team at Vanderbilt University. And the question is, does it matter whether you have access to ECMO or not? What happened to those candidate patients that for ECMO, and does it matter whether we had access to ECMO or not? And of course, in that center, there were 240 patients that were referred to Vanderbilt at the time frame they were looking at. 90 of them met criteria, but of those that were not able to get access to ECMO, the story's meaningful, and the research they did there was also important in that 90% of them did not survive. And so this leads a little bit into our work ahead. Sometimes the media is a great partner, and I wanted to just thank the media that we worked with. We worked with them all the time. There were times where I'd get a call, and can you be on TV in, an hour from now, and just talk to us a little bit about ECMO and what we're seeing in the registry and the dashboard. But there were some who did an enormous job, and it also helps inform our work as an organization. Last but not least, I wanted to touch on the power of social media. I think we've talked a little bit about both sides, what's positive, what's negative, but I was so happy to meet Jenna Miller yesterday. I know she's here, and thank her for the post she put on Twitter, which again at the time highlighted something that we weren't hearing about. Number one, an adolescent. This was a 12-year-old patient of hers, Trevor, and he was that day decannulated from ECMO after a 73-day run. Now, at the time, people were saying kids just don't get COVID, so don't worry about it. But this was an important story at the time for a few reasons. One, it highlighted a child getting sick, really sick with COVID. Two, it highlighted a 73-day ECMO run. You all are aware of this because we're in this field and we know this, but the 73 days is a different level of commitment that you all had to struggle with throughout this pandemic about who has access, circling back to the prior article, and the kinds of decisions we make patient by patient to try to do the best for the people in front of you. So I just wanted to thank all of you that participated in social media and worked with the media throughout this pandemic and even now about what lies ahead. So thank you. Some updates from ELSO. We've been doing a few things, as you know. I'll try to highlight a few of them and probably won't hit 50% of some of the new things, but one of them is we took some time, our board, last year to look at our mission and vision statements again, and we hope this one feels more inclusive and more purposeful and exciting for all of you. There's a role for all of you here. We hope you're inspired by the mission and vision that we now have. Along with that, some new strategic themes. We'll highlight these in our annual report. They're on our website. But for all the work that we're doing, we're using these strategic themes, which frankly came from you. We sent a survey out to ask for your help. What should we focus on? And 1,000 of you sent us back, what should we focus on? So this is some of those suggestions you all had organized by themes. So getting into the themes and what's new and what's been going on, you're all aware of the COVID-19 dashboard that we put up, but this year we thought, let's take that a little further and make the entire registry live. So you now have access to the entire registry live. You can filter some things and see some things, not everything, but it's at your fingertips. And that was something that Ryan Barbaro, our chair of the registry committee, I know Joe will continue to help think about what helps you with tools that you can use in the field. And so that was one of the things that we thought was meaningful. As we're looking at live data and the power of data, and I know you've been on this journey with us, but I wanted to highlight a couple things that live COVID-19 dashboard showcased for us. One was, how were the COVID-19 patients doing? And so we have 2 Lancet studies here to show you today. The first one over here is our early findings globally about how ECMO patients were doing, COVID patients were doing on ECMO. Early findings, fairly similar to ARDS. But because we have a live dashboard and we could see how patients were doing, as 2020 progressed, we noticed mortality was worsening. And so we did a follow-up study in the Lancet that there again showed globally how the patients were doing on ECMO. This informs national policy, it informs global policy about access to ECMO, and should we bother with a resource-intense thing during the pandemic. So your collective work to contribute to the ELSO registry helped shape policy at the country level, at the World Health Organization, at NIH, and other entities. So thank you for everything you did as an ELSO community to contribute your data in a timely way and what we've been able to do with that work. Another thing you have access to is quality benchmarking. If you're a new program, how many people in here are part of a new or newish program? So this kind of information can be very important to you, patient by patient, as you're getting started. Are we in line with what we'd expect with this kind of patient, based on the kinds of patients that we see, with now 180,000 patients to compare with? And it's helpful for teams. ECMO's hard. It takes the whole team. It helps to have some data and some context for with what you're doing. And I know you'll hear more about this and the next slide, which is compliments of our biostatistician from the University of Michigan, Phil Boonstra. He'll talk about this tomorrow morning in breakout session 24. Hopefully you'll get a chance to hear from him. But again, your data helps us think about how do the devices perform. And so our device developers, who are many of our partners here today that sponsored this meeting, they help think through clinical data, real clinical data, how do we do better? And that's part of how your data helps inform and improve what you all have as practitioners at the bedside. No one should be able to read this. The point here is that there's a lot of stuff. And this stuff is a lot of the work of Janelle Badulak, who's sitting up here in front, Bishoy Zachary, who's sitting over here and chairs our education committee, and about 100 of you from around the world that help us establish an ECMO standard for education. This is our methodology. So as we work together to create a standard, what we think is important, you all know as you debate how to treat this patient and what's the best practice, we have to try to reach consensus. And so part of what's in here that you can't read is the work we did to try to achieve consensus and bring that forward to all of you so that we can do this. Provide ELSO Foundations, which is a virtual program. That's important to us as a global organization. It's hard to align time zones sometimes, so you now all have access to this at your own pace, at your own time of day, at your own convenience, to go through a global standard now for ECMO education for the adult population. One thing I'm really proud of here is to see the different countries that are participating in this already. This is less than a year old, and we have almost 600 learners that are participating in that, as well as the certification exam to go with it. And we have a similar pie chart here. This is ELSO certification for the first time that we're able to offer for the adult practitioner, the whole team. What we're developing is for the entire ECMO team, and that's how we do our work. Endorsed courses, another commitment to bringing high-quality education to everywhere around the world. We just launched this in April, and I'm so proud to have 7 programs already on this map, none of which are in the U.S. We're hoping to get some from the U.S., but this is another way we're trying to make sure teams have what they need to provide high-quality training for the entire team. We do have in-person simulation training and in-person training that we're bringing back. So November, we have one of these close to Ann Arbor, Michigan. If you're interested, please join us. But you'll see more and more of this on our education site. What's coming up in education? We've heard from those of you that took ELSO Foundations. Can't we have a study guide? We're working on that. Can't we have ELSO Foundations for neopeds? We're working on that. Can't we also update some of our content? And next week, I'm happy to announce that we will have ELSO Foundations available in Spanish. So we're getting there a little bit, bit by bit. And then I'll just showcase a few of the monographs that are produced. On the my far right, your far left is already in production. Again, Janelle played a role in this. Zach Shinar as well helped lead the development of an ECPR monograph for emergency physicians. There are 2 more that will be released yet this year, and Roberto LaRusso is our senior editor for post-cardiotomy ECLS. And then a group of wonderful senior editors helped develop a neopeds simulation scenarios. There's about 100 of them that were produced in partnership with IPSS. So just a few things that we're working on here. Everyone here that's in person in this conference will have access to all of this material for our virtual program. We'll be opening that up next week, and just wanted to make sure you're aware of that. So With that, there's another little publication that we have to showcase, but I thought that would be better done by Graham McLaren, its senior editor. Graham? Sorry, couple last things about our team. If you know this guy, Peter Reiches, he would celebrated 25 years here at ELSO this year. He's looking a little serious here, as he often does. And then I did want to thank our whole team, but also Valia Antonini, who's sitting right here and is our social media director and the face of ELSO. Every publication that comes out, every major initiative that we produce, Valia basically works 24/7 as much as I can tell and helps get that word out to you. Thank you, Valia.
Thanks, Christine. So the Red Book is produced every 5 years. And when we got together to think about how to do this one, we recognized that a few things we wanted to do better. In previous editions of the Red Book, one problem had been you would often get one or two authors from the same institution writing an entire chapter, and we thought that didn't represent an appropriate breadth of practices. We wanted to get more global involvement, and we wanted better diversity and balance. So this, I think, is the biggest Red Book in terms of contributors ever. There's more than 230 authors. So to those of you who helped write these chapters during the pandemic, despite your workloads, thank you so much. Thank you to my editorial group, who did a fantastic job of all the work. There's a number of new chapters which haven't been touched upon in the past, which I think were sins of omission, which I hope we've now corrected. So obviously there's a chapter on emerging infectious diseases. That would be somewhat reprehensible if we'd ignored that. We have chapters on nomenclature as ELSO's official stance on what's the difference, for example, between ECLS and ECMO. Is there a difference? Does it matter? We have chapters on physiotherapy and mobilization. We have chapters on how to deal with difficult patient populations, such as the elderly. You know, at what point do we say this patient's too old for ECMO, which is a very difficult question to answer and something that we spend a whole chapter trying to address. One thing we also wanted to do is get in real content experts who might not, well, in some cases they are ECMO experts as well, but not always. So for example, with the chapter of emerging infectious diseases, we invited two people from the WHO to help flesh out that chapter from an infectious disease and public health point of view. And then we also, for example, in our chapters on trauma and also in crisis management, we got members of the US military to come and help us write that chapter. So the trauma chapter isn't just car accidents, it's things like blast injuries and bullet wounds, etc. The dedication, of course, was to all of you for dealing with this massive upsurge in workload and stress and everything else that came with it during the pandemic. So thank you. And lastly, how can we have a book without acknowledging Dr. Bartlett? I'm not sure if he's here. If he is, I can't see him. But there he is. Hello. Because as you may have heard, this is the 50th anniversary of the first ever ECMO report in humans. And Dr. Bartlett was there from the beginning. And he's still here telling us what to do. So thank you very much. With that, I'll stop. Thanks. There is still a few minutes left in this session for a panel discussion. Yeah. So if I could ask Gideon and Dan Cara to come to the stage. Any of you who have questions, please come up to the mic.
Great, thank you, Graham. And oh, great, we have some questions for the audience. Please step up to the mic. I'll start with you.
Hi there. This question's for Gideon, and it may not be fair as the representative for like all of the media, but how do you have some kind of accountability, for the media? You had mentioned in terms of how they report certain things that are newsworthy, but may sort of paint an unbalanced picture of things. While you want to try to be fair and balanced, both sides don't necessarily have the same amount of data, the same amount of consideration that should be given. So painting both sides may actually be doing a disservice to the public. So how do you kind of hold media accountable, or what are some things that you might tell us in terms of the way we counsel patients who come in with a lot of, say, fake news or false information?
Sure. I think this is still on. That's a very good question. Yeah, there is really, I mean, different countries have different rules regarding the media, obviously, but in the U.S., it's a free-for-all, which, it's enshrined in the Constitution, freedom of the press. I think it's mostly a good thing, but the downside is there is no accountability in that sense. There's no government authority that regulates that. So I think you, as a community, if you see an article that is in a news organization that has false information, you should bring that to the attention of that organization and ask for a correction. Most reputable news organizations will correct information. But often the damage is done, and I'm as frustrated as you are by the misinformation that circulates on social media, and I honestly have been thinking long and hard about it, and do not have a good answer for it at this point. I mean, I think it's really it's a very challenging situation right now that all this medical misinformation circulates. And if anything, the traditional rules of how you judge the credibility of sources of information have been turned upside down because, there's been a whole push against so-called elites, and media elites, medical elites are now seen as diminished and not the people you should trust. And so it's a very challenging situation. And I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you.
Thanks.
Janelle.
Thank you very much for joining us. This is another question for Gideon. One of the things that I've noticed is kind of this, I don't know if it's a divergence or maybe just kind of a slow transition from news that was kind of vetted as fact and maybe more entertainment and opinion pieces. And so I'm very curious, from your point of view, how does the media handle that, and do they feel like different outlets, do they feel like they want to identify more clearly which news is fact and which is opinion and entertainment?
Yeah, again, I'll go back to there's various parts of the media landscape. So I think, traditional news organizations like ours or major newspapers work very hard to try to separate what's opinion and clearly label it from what's news. But there is also this, I think there has been a tendency to more incorporate an analysis or commentary in what would ordinarily be news articles. So there's definitely been a drift in that direction. And part of it is because is a counter to the misinformation. So if you, as a journalist, write an article and something is, if a public figure says something that's incorrect, we have a duty to say that's wrong. And that may come across as opinion, but it's actually fact, right? So, but it's not, it's a tricky thing. And there are points where I think that sometimes, where do we not quote when a public figure says something that's clearly incorrect, maybe we should quote them. But it's a really difficult thing to, if it's, say, a president, for example, it's a difficult thing to do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Yep. This is not related to media. In ECMO, there's, of course, increasing literature about how to do things and what you shouldn't do, but much of it, falls into the extended case series, the anecdote, the single series, the single center report. Very little is multi-center, even less is randomized. The Red Book and at least most of the recent ELSO guidelines I've seen really don't make any comment officially about grading the evidence. There's no, this is a grade A recommendation based on multiple randomized studies. Much of it is consensus. And, any thought about having a formalized rating of the evidence like the ACCP does with most of their guidelines?
That's one for Dan. Not on.
Hello. So it's a great question. And I think what it really reflects is the quandary of not having the evidence means that grading the evidence, you end up with grade E. It's
Right.
expert opinion.
Much of the evidence would be D or E.
Absolutely. And so we have embarked on that. Joe Tona is leading an effort for a combination of ELSO and the Society of Critical Care Medicine to do graded methodology. The entire effort will have taken over 2 years by the time it's ready. So we have to be very selective about which ones we do that for. And we're doing that in the areas, or at least we project doing that in the areas where we have the most evidence so that it's the most valuable. Otherwise, what you end up with is the same thing essentially as the guidelines as you perceive them now, which is it is the consensus of our community based on our combined experience, and it is expert consensus. At this time in the field, that's the charge that we have. We need the data. We need to be going out and getting that data higher and higher quality so that we can make higher and higher quality recommendations. I think the field has moved tremendously over the last decade in that direction. I think the quality of evidence now, there's no doubt, is far better than it once was, but we have a lot to do that's ahead of us. So I think in that journey to getting there, you'll see more and more of that over time. And obviously, if you have thoughts about where that might be most valuable, that's incredibly important to us, and we would encourage you to get involved.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great. Next question.
Good morning. Thank you for bringing all of us together, first of all. My main question, again, non-media question, I just want to know whether ELSO is at a point where it can bring or synchronize all the different boards, when the trainees and the different practitioners and fellows, they come to the ECMO program. Now more and more people are interested in getting education in ECMO, and Bishar is leading such a great effort. But I can see the different stands from different boards, anesthesia board, pulmonary critical care board, internal medicine, there are emergency medicine. So is also at a point where they can synchronize all these efforts from different boards and come up with uniform guidelines rather than different centers doing different things based on their practices and their own biases.
Yeah, once again, that's a terrific question. It's, I think at some level it's motherhood and apple pie. We absolutely would all agree that that's the right thing to do. In practice, it's really difficult. You have all of these players within the space who have different agendas, different perspectives, some of that very legitimate, and some of that very healthy because it challenges our underlying assumptions. Aligning them is very difficult. That said, that has to be our mission. That absolutely has to be our mission. One of the great strengths of ELSO, just looking around this room, is that it really is one of the very few truly international organizations. And it's one of the few that really, and there are others, but that is truly interprofessional. This is, an organization that values every member of the team because that's what ECMO is. ECMO is, it is the essence of teamwork and bringing an entire team together. So we have a perspective that a lot of other societies that are more narrowly focused don't necessarily have. I think what we need to do is lead that effort over time to align the societies. And as I say, even just from the last example of working with SECM, we have many partner organizations, AHA, STS, other international organizations, ESICM and others, that we have to begin to partner with more, but there are many. And everybody's interested in ECMO now. I mean, 10 years ago, it was ELSO, and no one else cared. And now everybody's interested. So as they grow and in their interest and participation, it is incumbent on all of us to try to bring them into the fold so that we can unify the message that we give to the community. Yeah, thank you for asking that.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one brief question.
Just to piggyback kind of on the education piece, what process or can you guys guide us? Our center would love to be a center where we could do more education. We have a huge ECMO sim lab and things like that. Does ELSO have some type of process to help us and guide us to kind of steer our way to help support our region, you know, and outside facilities and training? So
I'll try to answer that, but one of the people that can answer that best is very close to you, and that's Bishoy Zachary. But we are working on having standards for what we hope yields high-quality ECMO education for the whole team. So the didactic portion that you educate and train your team on, the simulation portion, the cadence of those things based on the volume of ECMO patients that you have. If you're a lower volume center, in order to help your team feel confident and competent for any ECMO patient that you see, if you do 5 a year, you'll need to keep them ongoing in simulation so everyone feels good about the kinds of things that might come up while you're taking care of a patient on ECMO. And so it depends on the size of program you are and the kind of patient population you're trying to address, but we are absolutely developing those tools and happy to work with you on that. And that's true for every center that's there, so we try to make that as standard and available to everyone as much as possible. And at the same time, we have a team that we've been developing that can go to a center and really evaluate that. If you're interested in doing that with us, we'd be happy to do that.
awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, I would like to thank all of our panelists for a wonderful session. And now we'll have a 30-minute break with the breakouts to commence at 10 a.m. Please visit our exhibitors in the meantime, and see you at 10.